Hello everybody, and welcome to day 4 of the Cambridge Conference on Catastrophic Risk. This is session number 4, and the topic we're discussing today is global justice and global catastrophic risk between terror and error. My name is Natalie Jones. I'm a research associate at CSER, and I'm your chair for the session. If you've been tuning in for the whole conference, welcome back. And if you're just joining us, it's really great to have you here. So just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Please note this is being recorded, but no attendees can be seen or heard. You should be muted on arrival, and I would like to ask you to please stay on mute throughout the session. We're very keen for your questions, so please use the Hoover or the Zoom chat box in the web browser or the mobile app to ask questions at any time. If you can please include your name and organisation, that would be great. The recording will be uploaded to YouTube and the CSER website after the conference. And for those of you on Twitter, the hashtag for this conference is CCCR 2020. And to find out more about the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, please visit www.cser.ac.uk. I would also like to thank Tom McLean for joining us, who is live during the entire conference, which for me personally is a great silver lining of this online format. So we have 2 panelists today. First, we will be hearing from Ndidi Nwaneri. Ndidi is a social development and public policy consultant and an emerging global catastrophic risk scholar who is from, lives and works in Nigeria. She has held numerous leadership positions in the Nigerian civil society and public policy sectors, and currently sits on the board, the executive board of the International Development Ethics Association. Her professional specializations range from community and social development to public policy and international development. Ndidi holds a PhD in social and political philosophy from Loyola, University of Chicago. Her research interests include global equity and justice, environmental ethics, Africana philosophy, critical race theory, and feminist philosophy. And then after Ndidi's presentation, we'll be hearing from Bentley Allan. Bentley is Assistant Professor of Political Science and an affiliate of the Environment, Energy, Sustainability and Health Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where his research focuses on the history and theory of international order, global environmental politics, the role of science and expertise in global politics, and qualitative methods. Bentley has published numerous papers, and his book, Scientific Cosmology and International Orders, received the American Political Science Association's Don K. Price Award for the best book in science, technology, and environmental politics. Bentley holds a PhD in political science from the Ohio State University. So without any further ado, I will hand over to the presentations, and please put your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the talks.
Okay, so the first question I'm going to address today, which is really the central question, is the question of how best do we include questions of global inequity, which includes global extreme poverty and inequalities within countries, between countries, intra and inter country inequities. So my central thesis is that while inequities are global inequity is important, it becomes extremely harmful. We can only study it or understand it with regards to catastrophic and existential risks at the points where it intersects with such risks. Now, the reason is because global inequity, which includes global poverty and all sorts of global injustice, are the result of social processes. And social processes are man-made, they're based on decisions, they're human-made, forgive me. They're based on decisions, they're based on actions, inactions. Therefore, they're not the same kind of things like other risks. Traditionally, what we study at risk, for instance, they're not incidents, right? It's not about whether or not someone did something with an atomic bomb or a dirty bomb. It's not an incident. A social process is a different kind of phenomenon. So no, So to the question of does it make sense to include global justice considerations as a separate cause of risk, I would answer no, because it is only at the point of intersection that we study that. So the next question I'm going to address is the question of, so how does global inequity and injustice affect the current level of global catastrophic risk and the ability to manage it? Now, I would answer that by first explaining that it exacerbates effect on and response to. It is not, its profile is different. Therefore, it's, of course, the danger is in the intersection. Now we have to separate occurrence and response. So if a catastrophic harm occurs, how do we respond to it? Yes, inequality draws this huge line, as we can see with climate change. There's a big line between how it affects us and how we're able to respond to it. And I will say at this point that that is the difference between anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic risks, right? There are certain risks that come and we have absolutely no control about those risks, right? That is one category of the potential of such harms. Anthropogenic harms, we have some measure of control. Now, part of the confusion and the overlap is, let's think about climate change, for instance. Do we have control? We have control over creating it, but we have little control over how it now explodes on us, right? But we have control over how we can respond to it. So it becomes a different kind of thing from a real non-anthropogenic risk, like something from outer space, for instance, harming the planet. So they're different. So if we want to talk about worsening, let's think about occurrence and let's think about response. If we divide it, then we can see that where you are on the socioeconomic ladder has nothing to do with whether or not a non-anthropogenic risk could harm you, but it affects whether or not you can respond to it and how well you can respond to it. And so that's all I'm going to say about that because my time is limited. Then I'm going to go into the question of, which is really related, a related question of, does the distribution of international political and economic power play into the current level of global risks, right? And the way I would respond to that is, I'll rephrase the question. Basically, this question is saying, to what extent does do social processes, global social processes, that's how you can categorize economic and political processes, to what extent do they contribute to risk? So to an extent, I have already discussed that. It doesn't affect how certain things affect you, but it affects how your ability to respond to it. Then, now to the extent, so the third question I'm going to address is the question of, to what extent do current notions of global catastrophic risk reflect the particular views and concerns of global elites? And does this mean they need to change? I don't think that is fair to global elites. I don't think that question is fair. That's a very loaded question. Yes, of course, they do have access, they have leisure, they have more resources, they are able to address this question. But the question now is, a global catastrophic risk is a risk precisely because it is global, right? It affects everybody else. Now, the global division of labor, it makes sense for people who are able to address such issues. Now with regards to this phrase that is bandied around now, implicit bias, issues like implicit bias, of course they show up, but think about it. Academic research is elitist, right? And it affects everybody. Am I a typical African Nigerian woman? No. And my location is the reason why I can even have this conversation. So I don't think it's fair to say, oh, only the elites. Yes, only the elites are discussing it. They should discuss such issues with some awareness of where they're located, but I don't think that the questions should change because the questions are indeed global questions. So there should be a multiplicity of perspectives. We should try and diversify, but I don't think the questions are questions that pertain to any particular group. Now, the next question I'm going to address is the question of Lord Martin Rees's book, the 20-year-old book, right? That is the frame of this conference. So one particular issue that I'm going to, very rich book, totally relevant 20 years later, but I'm going to focus on the question of error versus terror. And you have to remember that research has changed, both in existential risk research and global justice research, particularly global justice research and its intersection with philosophy, right? And 20 years later, we have deeper understandings, better understandings. Error versus terror remains relevant, right? So this is human agency. It is either you're being deliberately malevolent or you made a mistake, like, oops, I blew up a continent, right? So those distinctions are valid. However, how do we now apply this to global social processes, right? And their potential to harm. One of the things I'd like to add is, let us look at global harms that derive from global processes from a particular perspective. Why don't we look at it as processes that harm the environment? However, they harm both the physical environment and the human environment. It is not politically correct to question the global economic, financial, political, and economic order. But it's important to note that global justice research has shown that at the level of large collectives, lack is no longer an economic issue. Lack becomes a political issue. It is a power issue, right? So error versus terror makes sense, but to what extent can we categorize social, political, and economic systems under error versus terror? My position is that we are where we are globally because of action and inaction. It doesn't matter how complex it is. The important thing is that whatever a person does is an expression of agency. There could be a long distance between action and eventual reaction or eventual effect that leads to a particular reaction. But the important thing is that expression of agency creates responsibility. So I will not say that error versus terror is wrong or we can't use it anymore. But I think it could be problematized. It could be made more complex to accommodate what research has shown in the last 20 years. Now, the next question I'm going to address is the question of, I've already gone into it, the question of responsibility. If we're going to address economic systems, political systems that are producing detrimental results, we need to rephrase those systems as the violation of the negative duty not to harm. It becomes very problematic when it is complex. The more complex it is, the more problematic it is, the more people can shirk responsibility. But this is an important thought. Holding that thought on one side, on the other hand, is the question of how inequity and poverty and inequality intersects with catastrophic or existential harms. Last note about inequity and inequality. Sometimes we think because a society is poor, therefore there's a limit to what people have access to. I'd like to point out that the Gini coefficient is very, very, the poorer a community is, let me put it in simple terms, not in economic terms. The poorer a society is, the higher the inequities and inequalities within the society. Now, this is received wisdom, we all know this. Now, I'd like to point out the meaning of inequality within a poor society. What that means is that you have a small fraction of people with a lot of money, a lot of access to resources, access to huge quantities of resources. That is the definition of inequality, economic inequality. It means that the money is amassed somewhere. Now, this is related to existential and catastrophic risk, particularly anthropocentric risk, particularly risks that are related to technology and misuse of technology. Do not presume that because a society is poor, therefore, that society does not have access to that which can harm the whole world. The society does have access to that which can harm the whole world. However, that access is concentrated to within a very, very small group of people. Now, how such social processes intersect with existential and catastrophic risk is subject for needed additional research, but it's important to know that it is at these intersections that we should be concerned, particularly if we're global justice researchers. And at that point, I'm going to end. Thank you very much for listening. Look forward to meeting you. Bye.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be participating in this conference. So my talk is called Global Justice and the Energy Transition. And I really started from the premise that was given in the instructions to the panel to answer the question of, is inequality an independent factor in global risk, independent from terror and error? And I'll just give you a quick roadmap of the talk here today. I'm going to start with some overview of the trends and regimes, what I'll call regimes of global inequality. I'm going to show you that rising inequality, I'm going to argue that rising inequality increases the risk of global catastrophe. And then this is going to put us in a little bit of a dilemma, because I'm going to suggest that the most expedient form of decarbonization probably increases global inequality. And then all I can do in the time that we have here today is really pose this very difficult overarching question, which is, what does decarbonization that reduces global inequality like? But I'm going to try to put that in like the largest possible frame, not a kind of practical frame. Okay, so let's see how this goes. So this is a little look at trends in global inequality. This is the share of personal wealth in some of the largest countries in the world. And what I want to highlight here is the overall trend downwards from 1910 down to this trough around 1980, and then the trend of increasing inequality in almost every advanced economy on this list. So we have decreasing inequality to 1980 and rising inequality thereafter. Just as a first cut, why did inequality decrease in the West and in these large economies until 1980? Well, first of all, there was massive economic growth. This was fueled by, in part, colonialism and the structure of the global economy that was created in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, and then also the petrochemical revolution. And you could also add in the electric revolution. These are outlined in a couple of studies of the massive growth of the 19th and 20th centuries. So you have massive economic growth coming from these like major social and technological transformations. You also have reducing inequality because of processes of democratization. The political scientist and sociologist Charles Tilly refers to democratization as a way of incorporating the forces of egalitarianism into public purpose. So part of democratization is delivering goods to a broader base of people than had happened under the aristocratic rule of previous European governance, but also the sort of feudal fiefdoms in China and Russia are also subject to this process in the 19th century. But finally, I think the most important factor from kind of a near-term perspective is the increasing power of the state during World War II. There's a massive centralization of the power in all states in the world through World War II. And so coming out of the war, the state has an outsized role in the economy. It has complete control over capital in this relationship in the early 1940s and 1950s. Capital then, if we're talking in the most abstract terms here, tries to reassert itself in the 1960s and the 1970s. But there's also a complete rewiring of global production networks. Under the auspices of the state, we get what Jeffrey Fear calls militarized globalization, which is the construction of global supply chains within the alliance network, which are designed to produce the most efficient mass production possible. So you really have a mass production economy that is created during the war in a way that hadn't been seen before. And you also get a new alliance between state power and the thermodynamics of fossil fuels, as Timothy Mitchell has outlined. And what this means is that you have an incredibly powerful state that has a ton of energy at its disposal, and it's unleashing massive economic growth, and it can really reduce inequality. And that, I want to point out, is really an exception to the historical rule of states and society. So there's a formation of a unique nexus of state power, global capital, and energy in the post-war period that makes it possible to reduce inequality. And that's not quite a real nailed down causal argument, but it'll serve the purposes of this talk. So, after 1980, you see a major rise in inequality. And there's a couple things going on there. We are seeing a rise in inequality, even though China's middle class, which you can see here in, this is Lochner and Milanovich's famous elephant graph. You can see the trunk coming up on the edge of the graph there, which shows us that basically the middle classes of the world, basically China's middle class, is doing quite well. But the US middle class, the middle class in Europe, is not doing well. And the rich are doing very well from 1988 until 2008. So we have rising inequality despite the fact that we're bringing millions of people out of poverty and into the global middle class. This is from a study from the Stockholm Environmental Institute, which kind of tries to quantify how much of carbon emissions between 1990 and 2015 how much the increase in carbon emissions is distributed across the income distribution that we just saw, and their claim is basically that 35% of global emissions increases since 1990 are attributed to the richest 5% of the global economy. And their argument there is that, we really don't have an equality of carbon emissions. We have, sort of extreme inequality. So this sort of points us to the question, which again can't be answered in the context of this talk, which is, why did inequality increase in the West after 1980? So I'm going to give a really quick answer to this question, which again is just meant to move us to the next piece of this overly ambitious talk. This is from a study by Mark and Jonathan Hopkins called The Global Economics of European Populism. And what they're really trying to do is give us a characterization of the macroeconomic regime that made it possible to reduce inequality in the post-war era, and that which has overseen the rise of inequality in the post-war era. And the real shift here, I would say, macro regime 2, is the assertion of capital's power over the state. And the rising share of capital in GDP, and therefore the ability of them to translate, of capital, broadly construed, global corporations and elite wealth holders, to basically translate their share of capital into political power. We can move here into sort of like the dynamics of inequality to get a fuller sense of what the explanation is here. And what I want to point out is that there are recursive returns to inequality. So the great political scientist and sociologist Charles Tilly again argues that existing exploitation allows those who already benefit from inequality to use their power over subordinated populations in the acquisitions of new resources, and hence new means of exploitation. So using a little bit of inequality that did exist in the 1950s and the 1960s to basically exacerbate the differences over time. This is the basic trend of inequality since the trough in the 1970s. Now, we can't outline one single causal argument for how inequality has an effect on the kinds of things that we are to identify here under the auspices of global risk and the potential for catastrophe. So what I want to point out is a couple of different pathways, many of which interact and happen at the same time. And I'm going to outline 3 here. The first is that inequality leads to state capture, which undermines, so state capture by affluent elites, which undermines problem-solving capabilities of those societies, which then undermines the legitimacy of the state as a whole. And again, here, Charles Tilly is worth quoting. Inequality makes the role of governments worth fighting for, because it almost always includes, that's the inequality itself, almost always includes differences in access to violent means, which is to say that capital and particular forms of distribution are always guaranteed and underwritten by state violence. And therefore, capture of the state is always a key task for those who wish to exacerbate inequality. So we have inequality leading to state capture, which undermines problem solving. We have inequality, which makes distributions harder to find that everyone regards as being fair. And that leads to lower provision of public goods. And we can also talk about the erosion of social trust, which makes it harder to find fair distributions. So let's unpack these last two just a little bit. I think the first one is pretty clear, but I'll unpack the second two pretty quickly here. So countries with higher levels of inequality have lower levels of public goods provision. This is an empirical statistical fact that has kind of been supported by the game theoretic literature, which argues that unequal groups have a harder time solving public goods provision games, such as avoiding catastrophic climate change. And the basic findings that come out of a much larger literature here are basically that if the rich are not at risk, which they're not really in climate change, they can move, they can get food, they can shirk the worst consequences of climate change, they have a lower willingness to pay for the cost. And further, if they control political institutions, there's a lower likelihood that they're going to, invest in climate security, let's call it, at an optimal level. The second kind of causal pathway here is that countries with higher level of inequality have lower levels of generalized trust. And how does this affect it? This is a great quote from the great Don Kahan piece in 2003. Individuals who have faith in the willingness of others to contribute their fair share will voluntarily respond in kind. We don't always have to be trapped in the logic of collective action. We can sometimes move people into the logic of reciprocity. But high levels of inequality erode the social trust that basically underrides the logic of reciprocity. And without trust, there's little willingness to contribute to general public goods again in society. So how does this cash out? Blythe and Hopkins basically make the argument that median income, looking at median income growth and the populist vote share, that what we're seeing is that the macro regime 2, which has generated inequality, is basically eroding support for the state as a whole. And the response is then a populist government, which claims to secure the state for the people from the elites, right? And so this general rise of populism can be as a reaction against inequality. And here's another graph showing sort of a general trend between inequality levels and populist vote share in European states. And their argument is this, that the populist wave is more than just a rejection of existing elites and a demand for attention. It's a challenge to the model of governing capitalism in which elected politicians have little capacity for acting on markets to protect people from threats to their incomes and security. Because the state has basically handed over the power to capital in a globalized economy, it doesn't have the ability to protect citizens, and the general legitimacy of the state is challenged as a result. What's really, I think, going on here is, and this is Quinn Slobodian's definition of capitalism, or of neoliberalism, which is that, inequality and the subsequent pressures for populism are emerging from a systematic effort to protect capitalism from democracy. And that's how Quinn defines neoliberalism, and I think it's an apt one here. So populism is really a predictable reaction, this is Blythe and Hopkins again, to the increasingly undifferentiated policy positions of mainstream parties and the growing detachment of elected politicians from civil society. Now let's just apply this to climate change very quickly. Unsurprisingly, while there's lots of public goods provision in global climate politics, it tends to happen at the very local level. It tends to be California or Ontario or the northeastern United States, which tend to provide those public goods. And there just hasn't been major public goods provision at scale, either between countries or within countries. Among advanced countries, Europe has been the leader, and it has the lowest levels of inequality. So I think this kind of fits the overall trend of the argument. And US political institutions, the US, the most unequal society of advanced democracies, they've been almost basically fully captured by the rich, and this has been well established by American political scientists. And of course, we know that US has lagged on climate. So we can see these general arguments about inequality cashing out in the basic way that we have seen a slow response to climate change. And basically, just to complete the argument that inequality increases the risk of catastrophe, the hedging that we see amongst rich elites in the world on climate change, which is not denying it, but not really acting with any kind of urgency or fastness, increases the risk of catastrophe. And this is a probability distribution from Wagner and Weitzman's book, Climate Shock, which shows the chance at various concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, the chance of going over 6 degrees, which is what they define as catastrophic climate change. And you can see we're taking on non-trivial chances of catastrophic warming already, because there's really no way that we're going to be below 500 parts per million, I would say. So, I mean, let's switch the frame here to climate solutions. Is there a way to solve climate change that avoids public goods problems, that avoids trying to create a big pot of money that everybody has to contribute to? And that was basically the goal of the Kyoto Protocol under the global negotiations. One option might be to try to transition through competition. We'll use technological innovation to drive this process. We're going to allow capital and finance to lead, sort of aggressive capitalist financial model. And we're going to harness the power of geopolitical competition. So what Europe's basic strategy is, well, we need to reshore our value chains to keep China out of domestic, regional battery manufacturing. And harnessing that power of geopolitical competition helps create the will and the desire to really deliver major aggressive climate change. The problem with this is that it doesn't really address inequality between countries, and it doesn't really alter the basic structure of the macro regime that has overseen the increase in inequality and the basic unwillingness to really act aggressively on climate change. So I'll just conclude by posing this question. What does decarbonization that reduce global inequality look like? But I want to go back to that original frame of why we had decreasing inequality down to 1980 in the first place, which is that those were the exception. That was a particular kind of state energy hierarchy, which bucked the trend of state control over countries, which had basically marked the palace economies of the ancient world, and as well as the feudal economies of the Middle Ages world, as well as large empires in China and Central Asia that sort of dominated in the period before the advent of modern capitalism. And after the rise of modern capitalism, we really have this tight, locked knit, alliance between state, capital, energy, which the post-World War II era is really a large exception from. So maybe there's some hope that we can harness the decentralized power of solar and wind to create a more equal society. But I would say you have to free the production of solar and wind from those global value chains and really try to think about how we're going to use technology to help us reconfigure state, capital, and energy nexuses. So I think there's a real challenge if we want to think about how to create a long-term environmental situation that is safe for humanity from the catastrophic risk that is caused by the harnessing of state power for capital in a hierarchical global order. Thank you very much.
Right. Now that we've heard those excellent presentations, it's time to dig into a discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to. So I'd like to kick off with one question for each of the panelists. First, I'd like to ask Ndidi about, you briefly mentioned how inequality in poor countries with this high inequality gap can lead to social dysfunction. And we also heard from Bentley a little bit about the ways in which inequality leads to high levels of risk in the context of climate change in particular. But I was wondering if you'd like to expand a little bit on how you see these dynamics of inequality and risk playing out.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, sure. And then I'll ask a question from Bentley.
Okay, so what I mentioned briefly, and I did not expand on, is the nature of inequality, the nature of poverty. How does it play out politically? Poverty tends to go along with ignorance, right? And one of the things I mentioned is that the poorer a country is, the more inequality you find within the country. But there's another thing. Poverty and inequality also goes with social dysfunction. So what happens is that the checks and balances you have in other societies tend to, either they were never created or they're eroded. Inequality does that, right? So when you have a top-heavy, when you have a lot of money concentrated in a few hands, they're able to influence the political system, and basically nobody checks them. So what happens, or nobody checks the rich in a dysfunctional society. So what happens is that, for me, the risk I see there and the potential harm I see there is, so when a decision is made, or is the ability to act without checks, right? That is why I like to move the question of inequality away from the economic to the political, because that means because that now moves us to discussions about agency, about what people are capable of doing, right? So that's the point I wanted to make, the correlation between poverty and inequality, and the fact that internal inequality could lead to a lot of harm because because your checks and balances are eroded or were never there.
Very interesting. I think you're making a really good point about the about how we need to look at both the political and the economic, but especially, and not consider them necessarily as separate. The other thing that I think you speak quite nicely to there is this relationship between the kind of high income individuals and the state, and the way that the checks and balances are eroded in a way that I think fits quite nicely in with Bentley's concept of this kind of state capital nexus. And I had a question for Bentley also along these lines, because it really seems like in your talk, this relationship between the state, global capital and energy is key. And you point out in the period where inequality was decreasing, the state took primacy over capital, whereas in the period where inequality is increasing and the rate of growth of global carbon emissions has been increasing, capital has kind of asserted more of its power over the state, right? And as historians have noted, historically, the power of labor has also acted as a check or a counterweight to that of capital in this sort of early 20th century period. For instance, winning protections for workers like the 8-hour workday or prohibitions on child labor. So I was wanting to know if you see a role for labor as another sort of party in this mix.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's right, and that historians are right about the importance and the power of labor. And Timothy Mitchell, who I mentioned in my talk, is really good on this in the sense of really integrating labor into that nexus, in the sense that, you know, as the form of energy changed from coal to oil, global labor was actually disempowered in its ability to check capital, because coal, you know, you had to go deep in a mine, and if the worker just wasn't going in there, then, you know, they had control over the checkpoint. Whereas in global oil, you're creating a shipping network that traverses the oceans, that has far fewer workers at the helm, and far lower rates of unionization in that sector. And there was always the ability to drive a race to the bottom through competition amongst ports and shipping companies in a way that was harder to do under coal. So the actual energy transition itself is not independent of the power of labor in the period in which I outlined. I do think that there's a role for labor to play today, and an important one, but I think that labor is kind of boxed in at the moment in the West, in the North. And I think that we don't have time to resurrect labor before we avoid global catastrophic risk. And so key to Ndidi's point, the thing that she keeps saying that really resonates strongly with me is kind of, we have to move to agency, we have to move to action, we have to move to like, what levers can we pull now? I mean, my talk is very structural in the sense that it's operating at, you know, 10,000 feet, but it's not meant to stay there, right? It's meant to point us into avenues where we can actually exercise agency. And so in that sense, I think that there's certainly a role for labor to play, but we can't equate the prospects for avoiding global catastrophic risk due to climate change with the prospects of labor, because that's a doomed mission.
I'd like to come back to that point about action and kind of what we can do now later in the discussion, hopefully. But turning to some questions we've received from participants. So Catherine Rhodes from CSER asks, I'm interested in your thoughts on how global inequalities can undermine trust between states and disincentivize the sorts of global cooperation needed to prepare for and respond to catastrophic risks. So it'll be good to hear from both of you on that. Maybe to reverse the order, maybe Bentley can go first on this one.
Sure. Yeah, that is a really important and interesting question. I think that what we saw in the history of the climate change negotiations through the UN FCC is basically this dynamic where poor countries who didn't cause the problem kept saying to the rich countries, yeah, this is your responsibility and you need to step up and take responsibility for this. And then basically those rich countries having a political problem and selling that message to their publics, which is to say it was very difficult for them to step up and say, okay, we're going to do this all by themselves. There was, a famous amendment, a famous bill passed in the Senate that basically, in the US Senate, that basically said, look, we're not doing this without India or China. And that passed 99-0, which is to say it had extremely strong bipartisan support in the US in the 1990s, that the Kyoto was dead on arrival if Annex II countries like China and India were not included in the deal. So that for sure is a problem, both as an empirical fact and also as a theoretical fact. The findings that I presented in the talk about how, in the experimental games, it's harder to find a distribution when there's high levels of inequality. Those findings would apply to bargaining amongst states, just as they would apply to bargaining within societies, within societal groups. So I think that's a huge issue. At the same time, I think the dynamics are really shifting. And that's what creates the opportunity for an aggressive capitalist solution to climate change, which is that India right now, it doesn't make sense for India to build out a fossil fuel infrastructure that has lots of transmission lines. It doesn't make sense for Nigeria to do that. It doesn't make sense for Sierra Leone to do that. It makes much more sense for them to experiment with microgrids and to have a decentralized renewable network. And it makes sense for them to just basically innovate through the problem of redeveloping their core energy systems. That doesn't make it easy in any of those societies, but it does mean that there's less of a point, I think, in arguing about how inequality is driving the problem and more about identifying how inequality creates opportunities for different countries in different ways. And I think that the countries like Indonesia and Nigeria, these large countries that have shown that they can have innovative and entrepreneurial sectors of their economy, have a real opportunity to develop domestic innovation. And what they need, I think, is help from the political economy side of the global order, which is to say, like, they need the rules to stop being so hypocritical and basically hampering the ability of those countries to enter into these global value chains that are needed in order to redesign energy systems all over the world. So we need alterations in the WTO rules, in investment treaties, in bilateral investment treaties, in order to provide more opportunity for these countries. And I think a lot of that is happening outside the global negotiations, which in my view is a good thing. Actually, it's a good thing that we're not trying to create a grand bargain through the UN FCC anymore, and that what we're basically trying to do in Paris is figure out where the movement and the action can actually get some traction. And I think that's a good thing, that we don't have to wrestle with inequality at the global level in the same way that we did under the Kyoto, Copenhagen failed path to a comprehensive global treaty.
So that I completely agree with you. I'm going to go in from a different dimension. Yesterday, when we were, the presentation yesterday, I had a question that I kind of withdrew because it went in the direction, the speakers kind of touched on it. So I figured, I won't ask the question. And there's a question of philosophical anthropology. Who is the person? It is really important that we understand issues of social ontology. What have we become? What are we? At both individual and collective level, we have created and we sustain and maintain persons who understand themselves as competitors with others. There's this spirit of competition is really problematic. But now we have a problem, right? On the one hand, competition creates, well, the argument is that competition creates more and more goods and services. We're all better off. That is the argument. Debatable, but I'm not going to go there. But the other side of competition is that we're now in a situation where there is such strong interconnection that we really are fundamentally, on a certain level, we have become one society. So I'm not being touchy-feely about this. The question of solidarity is no longer a question of we don't have that option anymore, right? So I'm going to give two examples, and they've been really, maybe I'm moving away from the question, but two examples. The first one is the question of, how can I forget COVID? Yes, the question of COVID, right? So I am as safe. What separates me? Let us say we find a vaccine that works. What separates me from an infection is what separates me from the last infected person is time. That is what separates me from the very last infected person. So hold that thought. Second thought is, I don't know if you've heard of this massive recycling plant somewhere in Ghana, where people really cheat, because I think Europe has laws where you cannot export waste. You can't outsource responsibility for waste disposal by claiming that, oh, it's going to be recycled. But of course, I mean, the market, right? People export waste claiming that, oh, it's going to be recycled, it's going to be reused, we're going to get more use out of it. What has happened in Ghana is that there's this area where there's this massive pollution and totally harm, right? People just take copper wire padded with insulation and they just burn it, right? Now, the effect of that might be, the result of that might seem far away, but at the end of the day, I'm sure a lot of that ends up in the ocean and it just goes right around and becomes everybody's problem. Now, we need to move away as people from the competitive mindset. We can't afford to have the competitive mindset because there's no way we can address global issues within a context of a globalized world society. There's no way we can address global issues with the mindset that created the problems, which is the mindset of competition. Now, I don't mean negative, vicious competition, but it's at the back of our minds. We really do think that life is a zero-sum game. Now, when we talk about solidarity, we know it is, so I'm trying to address the question about solidarity and cooperation. We know we should, but I don't know how we're going to get there, but I feel that it's the philosophical anthropology or the nature or the people that are supposed to cooperate. We really have to factor in what kind of people we are. If we don't do that, we'll just say things that sound good, but the actions will not match what is required. So I don't know how to get past that, but I just wanted to highlight that.
It's a really important issue, this question of how do we have a meaningful sense of solidarity among individuals in different parts of the world, given the sort of hyper-competitive sort of environment that we're living in and the forces we're exposed to. And Bentley, you mentioned, and I tend to agree, this notion that, yeah, there's questions of responsibility and inequality can be very dangerous or detrimental to political progress and concerning sort of international governance of existential risks. And if the inequality questions are there, it seems like they really have to be addressed, or it's going to be another kind of Copenhagen kind of, you know, no-show situations. So that seems to me like a pretty important lesson for future governance of catastrophic risks. I'm going to go to another question that's come in on Hoover, which comes from Clarissa Rios Rojas, who's a research associate at CSER. Her question is, I guess that with higher inequality, fewer people are interested in long-term views due to their duty to survive the day. And so I guess this is getting at people who are just focused on kind of short-term survival. And I guess this is speaking to what you said as well before, Ndidi. So her question is, so how can we make society worry about global risks? Is it good to focus more on the financial arguments? And can you share some best practices in this regard? For example, any instances you've had of success with kind of working with, I guess, policymakers or people in society to promote concern for these risks.
Is that for me or for Bentley?
That's for both. If you have anything to say, I'd love to hear it.
Bentley?
You can go first, please.
Oh, well, politicians are a problematic group. I'm trying to be diplomatic here. So the problem we have, and it's it's everywhere, most places. The politician is interested in getting re-elected. The politician is interested in other things. Tragically, the decision making of collectives is placed in the hands of the politician. So I practice public policy, and more often than not, what the politician does is they give you a blueprint, really, right? And they just give you this whole set of, anybody who has practiced public policy knows that they give you a blueprint and they tell you what boxes to tick. Nobody wants to rock the boat. So no, I have not met a revolutionary politician yet. Maybe they exist, but I have not had that privilege. So no, politics and governance and is not the way to go. It's highly bureaucratic. They don't think, I haven't met a politician that thinks beyond 20 years. Maybe, you have these grand leaders, right, that history talks about, but when you go into the civil service office, maybe they're hiding from me, but I haven't met them. So no, it's not going to come from that direction. There probably will not be success. It has to be individuals taking responsibility for their world. It has to come from outside. Now, if the noise is loud enough, the politician toes the line, not the other way around. Politics, leadership, they're too busy preserving themselves. They are not going to be the ones to take this up. So I don't, maybe it's not fair on them, right? Maybe this blanket view is not fair, but structures are set up in such a way that hardly will you be able to make that kind of progress, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I think that on the question of how you kind of connect short-term and long-term view, or how you get, short-term humans to take a long-term perspective, is a really interesting one. And I think like effective governance strategies are ones that try to link those two, to try to link the long-term and the short-term together. And I guess like what I have in mind in the climate policy space is like, for example, when the UK set an overly ambitious at the time target, to get to net zero, and then created, the UK Commission on Climate Change as a delegated organization that was designed to mandate to meet those goals. What that does is, like, as a political scientist, I tend to see like these mandates and these goals as being like, an unfunded mandate. Really, is that going to do anything? And I've tended to be, when I was purely in academia, very skeptical of these kinds of things. But right now, I'm in Canada working full-time on climate policy. And what I see in places like California, the UK, and British Columbia, where I'm located, is that policymakers have these goals. Like, we have to get to net zero by 2050 or 2045 or 2040. And there are bureaucrats in those organizations that really are worried about the bean counting. Like, where am I going to get the megatons? Where am I going to get the megatons? And in a way, that's kind of a disappointing narrowness of vision, right? Is that they're like concentrated on show me the tons of carbon dioxide emissions reduction. But at the same time, it's great to see that they are aggressive and laser focused on one of the things that matters, right? Which is actually reducing emissions. So I think that civil society organizations and scientists and activists that have really pushed these mandates and really pushed these targets and pushed countries to develop them are actually a really important part of the process, because what it does is it sets off a process of learning. Because now all the financial firms are like, oh, the government seems serious. We better figure out what this means for our business model. And the NGOs, for example, in the Biden administration, even, it got put in a speech that 40% of that $2 trillion that Biden was talking about was going to go to frontline communities. And the NGO world in DC that I'm kind of like weekly tapped into is like freaking out because they have no idea how they're going to devote $600 trillion to frontline communities, or $800 million to frontline communities. they just don't know how to do it. So then they have to figure out, at least in theory, how are we going to do this? Because we hadn't tried to do this. So those mandates, even when they're unfunded, they catalyze a learning process whereby organizations and people in these different positions in society have to start to figure out what that goal would actually mean for their business model in a concrete way. And that catalyzes action and starts moving people in the right way. And so that's the kind of thing that links the long-term and the short-term. It gives people this like short-term laser narrow focus that sometimes as a political scientist I find annoying, but it really is, it is connected to the long term. It's connected to a long-term view. And that only happened because of political action by citizens, you know, putting pressure on the governments to really adopt these goals, and by visionary leadership of a few politicians who were willing to say, look, we have no idea how we're gonna do it, but we're gonna put it on the table anyway and see if we can figure it out. And then it turns out there's all these brilliant people who've got great ideas about how to do it. So I do think there are ways to get out of that trap. And I do think in climate change, we're kind of on the cusp of getting out of that trap. So it's an exciting time to be in that business, I think.
Yeah, so many points here I want to pick up on, but we have so many questions coming in as well, and I'd like to try and get through as many as possible. We have a really, I'll do one more for each of you from different people here. So we have one from Alexa Haggerty. Question for Ndidi, which is, given your expertise in environmental ethics, Africana philosophy, critical race theory, and feminist philosophy, can you talk more about how our philosophical underpinnings inform hegemonic views of the intersection of risk and inequality, and possibilities for other ways to imagine this relationship?
So this is enough material for a book, and but I completely understand. So the question is, I had mentioned philosophical anthropology. At the end of the day, you see as, right? You see as a being, and you act as, right? So I guess I'm going to interpret the question as, are there alternative ways of beings that will not lead to our extinction? And are we bold enough to address these ways of being? Again, I'm going to refer back to that question yesterday, where we were talking about persons who can hold such conversations, right? Who is qualified to speak? What alternative epistemologies exist? I am fortunate to straddle three communities, three societies. There are different ways of seeing the world, but the question is, who has the bigger gun? If your gun is big, you will force people to see the world in a particular way. There are numerous alternatives, but we have been trapped into one: money, competition, right? They're not even amassing. One of the challenges, one of the things that I keep harping on and on in my research is, isn't it shocking that there are no limitations? There are absolutely no moral or legal limits to how much an individual or a collective could amass. Now, that sounds very leftist, but when you think about it, when you move away from it and think about it, you're like, wow. So when the presentation was going on yesterday, and I forget his name, and I'm sorry, I don't remember, but a presenter yesterday was talking about how it is possible for us to increase our productivity such that we will benefit the society, you know, will increase our well-being, or at least that's how I understood him. And I'm thinking to myself, certain organizations that shall remain nameless in the last 6 months have made billions, right? And nobody thinks it's a problem, right? So the question is, how do we stop being what we are? Is it really possible? Maybe it's possible, but one thing we all agree, even those who are not in the room right now, on a certain level, a lot of people will agree that unless we make astronomical technological progress, we are done as a race. It's a matter of time. So maybe the astronomical progress will come. So I'm sorry, I can't quite answer the question. For instance, I could give you examples. There are certain communities where it is not money that motivates, for instance, the setting up of a dance troupe, right? You don't have the fact of belonging to a community is enough for them to contribute to social well-being. There are all sorts of examples, but they're not let into the room. Feminist philosophy has always talked about how real labor is that which is monetized. So you can spend 10 years of your life raising 3 children. That's not work, right? With all of that is well documented. But so whoever asked the question, please feel free to get in touch with me. But it's not something we can address here. It's the question of whether or not there are other ways of being and whether or not our collective epistemology permits other ways of seeing the world. There are ways we can see the world and we wouldn't be harming the environment so much, but try to get it past the room. It just won't fly because of who and what we are right now.
I want to take a crack at this question just really quickly in the biggest possible frame, because it's super interesting, and I'm really glad that Ndidi has raised the question of philosophical anthropology and the ontological underpinnings of these assumptions. And just to get back to the question, like maybe one way to reframe it is like inequality is kind of premised on a conversation about deprivation, like a relative form of position within a stratification, right? But that's quite separate from privation, right? Like that's quite separate from what it means to have a condition of material existence in a world as a biological entity, right? And our assumptions about deprivation are like heavily linked with the way that we understand and try to approach the question of privation, right? But privation is also not just purely a material fact, right? It is also like a spiritual and maybe more metaphysical one, let's say, right? In which the conditions of freedom are not set purely by whether or not your belly is full and you have a shelter, right? But by the conditions of freedom being presented by the capacities and tools that you have at your disposal for experiencing your surroundings in a variety of ways. And like what Marcuse and the Frankfurt School and critical theory that came out of that tradition kind of shows us is that our minds are not free in any kind of like basic way, right? So even our concern about privation, right, is already kind of ontologically pre-structured, right? So our concern with inequality is already starting from this like immense metaphysical load that has been heaped upon us by the Enlightenment. And I say us as like folks that are educated and dominated by the ontology of the West. And I deeply appreciate the perspectives of my colleagues who have found themselves grounded cosmologically in other traditions and have benefited enormously from those conversations and from the elevation of those voices in the recent changes in academia through the decolonized movement. But I would say that like once we like throw away modernity as being of value, right? Like let's just say, well, that doesn't determine my freedom or the conditions of privation in an important way. Then what that opens is like the possibility that catastrophe could be good. The end of civilization as we know it would enhance freedom. It would open up possibility. It would enhance capacity of humans to determine and re-experience their environment in new ways. That would be the precondition for decolonization, right? There's no way to decolonize within modernity. There's no way to provide that basic underlying freedom that some people really yearn for, that like when Marcuse and Adorno like turned to art and you know, drugs as like a way of finally breaking out of modernity from within the Western condition. Like that's the only way that the West can imagine it, right? Other cosmological traditions have rich resources for stepping outside of this and establishing the grounds for freedom and possibility. But for those of us that are kind of trapped within it, that those are the places that we turn. So I would just say that like, I personally do not think that catastrophe would be good. But once we throw that open, right, then the argument's on the table. And catastrophe might be something that we could embrace as a human race, as a way of restarting. And I just want to say that that argument is clearly implicit in the more radical post-humanist critical veins. And I'm not trying to pass judgment on that. I personally do not subscribe to it, but I think that it's an interesting and important intellectual avenue to explore.
Thank you so much for that. So much here, my goodness. So just to try and condense a few of these last questions into kind of groups and to sort of link them up with what we've just been talking about, because this is so fascinating. So kind of to combine two questions which come from sort of Tom Hobson and Nathaniel cook. So one of the speakers yesterday, Sherry Wells Jensen, asked us to think about who will be there in the futures we are talking about saving. And there's also an extent to which current global catastrophic research is largely performed by sort of middle-class white Anglophone men with STEM educations, and maybe we're neglecting some issues as a result. So I wonder what both panelists think about this question of kind of who have we got here in this room and who will be there in the future, given these kind of present historical, political and economic inequality and these structural questions that we are discussing.
Bentley, please.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure what I can say except to acknowledge that you know, I'm complicit there, and that my privilege has given me a platform to speak. I guess I would say that you know, I do believe in folks that are in my position trying to do what they can do to make the world a more just and equal place, and I try to do that, and also to elevate the voices of folks that have a different perspective, because I see the limits of my perspective every day. You know, I run up against it all the time, and so I know that we need other ideas and other perspectives, just as a purely practical matter, regardless of the fact that we're morally obligated to do so.
So with regards to the people in the room, in a world determined by access to resources, you're going to, and I alluded to this in my talk, you need leisure to be able to do this. So higher education is very expensive. Yes, it does exclude a lot of people. So who is in the room? The best the people in the room can do is, so research is very hard work. Writing is hard work. And it's not trivial, right? And it also takes a lot out of you, the person. If you're not genuine, it limits what you're able to produce. Therefore, it'll be very difficult for you to be working and thinking about other voices. It's hard enough capturing your own voice, right? So that flaw will always be there. One of the things I mentioned in the video is, at the end of the day, just occupy your position with some measure of knowledge, some measure of awareness of the people that are excluded. Yes, work towards including them, but at the same time, also be a bit more humble in your assertions. So who is going to be, what future are we talking about? Who is going to be present in that future? I do not know, and nobody knows. Now, the reason why I say that is that life has a way of, or the universe has a way of shocking everybody, right? Surprising everybody. Case in point, I have no idea what certain African countries did. They simply don't have COVID cases, infinitesimal. Nobody knows, and it's scary. The reason it's scary is that I'm scared, particularly as an African, I'm invested in that. I'm really terrified because what will happen? So it just reveals how ignorant we all are. We really are just groping around in the dark. And that should make us very, very humble, because there's way more that we do not know. And that should make us also very charitable. And I'm hoping that this will make us have more, increase our solidarity, you know, amongst ourselves, because we really are in a universe that could just end in 5 minutes. There's so much we don't know, right? So I have no idea who will be present in that future. I'm hoping that there will be people present in the future, that we don't completely botch it. But honestly, I don't think anybody can say with any level of certainty who is going to be present in our future. We don't know, we simply don't know, at least I don't.
Yeah, thanks for that. So probably have time for sort of one or two more questions, and I think this one follows sort of quite nicely on, and also kind of wraps its way back around to the sort of question of action and agency. So this comes from Alex McLaughlin. So Alex says, given the structural nature of these problems, I was wondering what you thought about our individual obligations. So for instance, if we care about climate change and mitigating those existential risks, should we focus on our own environmental footprints, or should we engage in sort of more civil disobedience and political protests, since these actions target the underlying political structures. And I guess I would add to that, is there a way of targeting this state capital energy nexus in a collective manner?
Bentley, please.
Yeah, I do think that I don't think we have an obligation to like curb our consumption or feel like our individual nature is, that our individual behaviors are part of the problem. I don't think we have an obligation to do that. I kind of cut against that basic individualist strain and environmentalism, which I think has been damaging. Instead, I getting back to kind of philosophical anthropology, I'm a Spinozan in a number of ways, which I'd be happy to talk about in the break room, maybe not here. But one of the things that Spinoza kind of tells us to think about is how we're really like sort of deeply integrated and interpenetrated by all of existence and all of history. And so instead of thinking about myself as having individual actions that are necessary, I instead try to think of myself as like a node in a much more complex web of networks and relationships. And then I try to think about how can I construct myself as a node that is an agent that is effective in this world. And so maybe that means like taking fewer flights, but maybe it means taking more flights. Maybe it means a variety of things. I won't go through the list of consumption habits that I have changed, because they're desirable to me in various ways. But instead, I think that we need to think structurally as individuals, right? I think the hardest part about that is like choosing the time scale upon which you want to act, which is to say that if you really care about humans in the Spinozan way, which is to say a radically open way, which is to say like nothing matters but us before God not being, what you think God is. Spinoza thinks God is an interesting thing. But like, then, okay, don't be practical. Invite catastrophe. Think about freedom and possibility in the greatest possible scheme. But like, I can't think that way. I got two little kids. I got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. And so I think on the 10-year time scale of like, I'm not going to sit and do nothing for the next 10 years. I'm going to try to like act and make sure that we avoid the catastrophic risk percentage points that I put up on the graph. So I think that even if that means taking a risk, and I think there is a risk, right, in moving with a capital and financial initiative to eliminate climate change. And that's basically what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis right now in my current position, is like harnessing finance for Canadian energy transition. And there's a risk in doing that. There is. And my gambit is that risk is less than the risk on the other side of the ledger, but I'm not sure about that. And I think it's very difficult to set the bounds of like, what kind of world am I trying to create based on a time scale that I'm operating at? And like right now I'm taking a pretty short time scale because I think that that's what matters. But maybe in 2030, I'll step back and be like, okay, I spent the last decade working at a tiny time scale. Now I need to adjust to a different one. So I think the question of obligation and pragmatics, like they can't really be separated. We have an obligation to act, but pragmatically we have to decide what time scale to act at, and which of our values is most important in deciding that time scale. That's a very difficult personal decision to make, I think. So I would encourage people to think about themselves as elements of these large structures and not to be naive about whether or not we're going to be able to reconfigure the state capital nexus like from the get-go, like we can't just recreate it, right? So it's a question of what is actionable within the 10 to 20 years that we have to really get out of this mess.
Thanks so much for that. So we're right bang on time, so I think we'd better wrap up now. Thank you so much to both of you. It's been such an insightful discussion, and I wish we could have a whole conference just on this. Next time it'll happen. And thanks to all the participants for your questions. And I'm very sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We had a lot. And thanks also to the conference organisers, particularly to Claire and Annie, who've been putting in such a lot of work behind the scenes. And again, Tom McLean, illustrator, it's been great to have him along today. So up next in the conference, we have a short break, and then we're coming back at 6:15 for session 5 on threats without enemies, natural global disasters and their consequences. So hope to see you then. Thank you again, and goodbye for now.